Hello, everybody in Psych 1. Welcome to another lecture for our class. I just want to remind everybody that this will be the medium that we're going to be presenting the classes through for the remainder of the semester. The plan was originally, once we had the shutdown, to go into Pimentel and record through the course capture option. But since all of the buildings in Berkeley are pretty much shuttered at this point, that's really not a viable option anymore. So much like the instructions for the paper and the very last lecture that we had before exam 2, I'll be recording all of the lectures, putting them up on YouTube so you can watch them. And I encourage you to try to keep with the schedule. Make sure that you're not falling behind on these, because trying to rush through these at the last minute is not ideal. I also want to mention before we get started that you will probably find that these videos and the length of them are going to be a little bit condensed in comparison to what we would be encountering in a class. That's because we don't have the interactive components that we have in our in-person class. But I'm also intentionally kind of removing some of the videos that are hard to reference as we're progressing. It just really messes with the flow of lectures to have you pause the lecture, go load a YouTube video or some other video link that I've provided you with, and then come back to class. So when I could do so, I've gotten rid of a lot of different videos. I think for the most part, we've actually gotten rid of all the videos for the remainder of the semester. Doesn't mean that they weren't interesting and worth watching, but it's just for continuity's sake and the ability to really streamline this. I made that decision. So hopefully you can stick with it. I do like the videos in an in-person class because it gives people the option of kind of having a little bit of a break and kind of collecting their thoughts, hearing a different voice. So since we don't have that, if you need to pause, get up, walk around about halfway through, I encourage you to do so. You're always more than capable of watching these in a couple different settings with the ability to pause things and kind of make sure that you're able to pay full attention to things as we progress. And we do have a decent amount of stuff to still get through, so I do want to make sure that you all are kind of aware of the need to keep up with this as if you were in in-person class. So let's get started on today's topic, which really is a topic that's going to introduce us into the two major branches of psychology that we're going to be discussing for the remainder of this class. The topic that we're going to be discussing isn't actually a branch of psychology per se, as much as a major figure in our history that really was paramount to the formation of these two branches of psychology that we'll be discussing in the next couple classes. And the individual that we're going to be talking about is somebody I'm guessing you've probably heard of before. When students are surveyed before taking intro classes about major figures in psychology that they've heard of, almost everybody unanimously identifies Sigmund Freud as kind of one of the first key individuals to kind of shape their understanding of what psychology could be about. It tends to make, unfortunately, lots of faculty members and researchers in not only psychology in general, but also the branches of psychology that we're going to be talking about, shudder, just thinking about how this individual still persists today, even though a lot of his theories and ideas have been rejected. But in a class like this, in an intro class, I feel like it's essential to not only mention Sigmund Freud, but give an overview of his ideas and his theories and his terms, not so we can necessarily celebrate a lot of the stuff that he came up with, because there is a lot of research that subsequently shown that Freud's ideas were faulty at best, if not really problematic. But it really does, when we're covering Freud, even with these issues, give us a sense of how these two remaining branches of psychology, what we call personality psychology and clinical psychology, really took shape. Because Freud, for all of his shortcomings, was a major player in the development of psychology and had a big impact on a lot of the different ways that different branches of psychology kind of spread out after he made some of his more outlandish contributions. So when we're watching today's video, I want you to keep in mind that there is a big difference between the theories of Sigmund Freud and concrete research behind how maybe things like personality and abnormal behavior kind of develop. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to necessarily talk about him. You can reject the ideas, you can reject even the person, but understanding that person gives us a sense of, again, how these fields evolved. So we're going to go over Freud. We're going to go over some big terms that you'll still see mentioned in our common culture today. And hopefully by doing so, you really will have a better grounding as we progress into some of the future topics in the remaining classes that we have. So who was Sigmund Freud? I guess first off, we should mention that he was born sort of near Austria. I don't have the exact location listed on the slide here, but he was born in a city that was near modern day Austria in 1856. And he was born into a family that was kind of well established. He was by far the youngest child within the family. And there were reports of sort of an unusual relationship with his mother, but most historians nowadays argue that that was probably, much like Freud's theories, kind of overblown. His mother was kind of extremely affectionate and definitely monitored him a lot more than his peers. But this is not necessarily that atypical with a youngest child, especially with a huge gap. And there weren't any reports of any major catastrophes or huge issues in his upbringing. In fact, most people, when looking at it, have argued that it was probably pretty normal outside of the kind of slightly overly affectionate, overly kind of mindful actions of Freud's mother, but definitely nothing that would really signal some of the ideas and theories that Freud later produced in his career. But what was a big shaper in Freud's career in the late 1800s as he started to come up was actually a huge movement that was going on in the medical world, in particular in physiology and biology. There was this movement that was called the psychodynamic movement. In fact, oftentimes Freud called his theory the psychodynamic theory of mental life. And the person that really spearheaded this psychodynamic movement was a researcher named Johannes Brucki, who pushed for biologists and medical doctors to kind of recognize the interactions between our minds and different ailments and things that were actually happening in our body. Yeah, in essence, it meant that when we're thirsty, it's not just that we're randomly thirsty, it's because there's probably something going on biologically that's triggering that thirst. There's a lack of water that sends a message to the brain that gets the brain to suddenly crave water. When we're tired, it's not that we just kind of arbitrarily decide we're tired, it's something's going on either chemically or at a cellular level in the brain and the body that's kind of triggering that fatigue. Now, this idea might seem kind of intuitive to many of us nowadays, but at the time, this was a whole brand new frontier that not a lot of people had necessarily explored. There had been some people that had looked at the interaction between the body and the mind in the past. We'd even talked about the humorous theories in one of our first lectures. But for medical doctors and other people to really take on this movement and explore it legitimately was kind of groundbreaking in the mid to late 1800s. And Freud, as a medical student, was on the forefront of this. And he really embraced these ideas of Brucki. He actually got his medical degree and started working as a physician in the early portion of his career, trying to treat a number of different patients, with the majority of his work being focused on individuals that had reported chronic pain, but there was no real identifiable source of the pain. So what Freud did was take the ideas of this psychodynamic movement and the notion that pain could be really a byproduct of elements of the mind, and see if he could help his patients with these chronic pain issues through not necessarily attempting to adjust the body itself, but to kind of access the mind and recognize the kind of circular interaction between our thoughts, our experiences, and how the body was experiencing different things in our environment. And to do this, he started collaborating with a number of different theorists, different medical doctors that were trying out a variety of different kind of new novel treatments for the different ailments that people were struggling with. And one particular individual that he started spending a large portion of time with was a theorist slash physician named Jean Charcot, who had started treating people with a really weird technique that had been established a number of years before called hypnosis. In sections, you're going to learn all about the basic elements of hypnosis, what it entails, how it actually works. But for Charcot and Freud, their take on hypnosis was very different from not only the take that Franz Anton Mesmer had on the idea of hypnosis, but also our current understanding of this altered state of consciousness. They started to believe that hypnosis was sort of a window into a different aspect of the mind that had been relatively unexplored, an aspect of the mind that Freud eventually called the unconscious. And with the recognition of this idea of the unconscious, Freud really set out to explore how the human mind worked and how different ailments and different problems could really be sourced back to this hidden part of the mind that nobody had really examined. And through this exploration of the unconscious and all the things that this branched out into, Freud started to really develop a following and started to try to find new techniques and ways that he could not only help people with physical ailments and physical problems, but also with mental ailments and mental problems. And eventually it expanded to really trying to understand the essence of individuals. This eventually led to his development of something called the Psychodynamic Institute, which was established in Vienna, Austria. And this institute really took on a number of individuals coming from a number of different perspectives in its attempts to really, again, understand the human mind and explain where lots of individual differences and maladies were potentially coming from. It took a while for this particular institute to take off, but by the time Freud reached his pinnacle, the Psychodynamic Institute in Vienna was something that many people all over the world were flocking to try to learn more about Freud's ideas as they were kind of continually unfolding. What was at the heart of this psychodynamic theory once it started to become established? As I mentioned, a lot of it revolved around this idea of this concept called the unconscious, this kind of hidden part of our mind. But there were a lot of other critical components to it that Freud started to lay out as he started to really establish this psychodynamic theory. One of the things he talked about was this notion that within each of us, there were a lot of different conflicting forces, things that were drawing us in different ways. He essentially argued in his psychodynamic theory that we are the byproduct of all these pushes and pulls that are constantly acting on us at any given moment. While you're sitting here watching these videos or playing with your friends or doing whatever, usually you're not just driven by one thing, the psychodynamic theory said. It's usually a multitude of things that have conspired to essentially put you in this moment at this time. And the exact combination of them is what also maybe explains some of the individual differences between you and others. This is where kind of the early roots of, again, not only clinical psychology came from, but also personality psychology came from. And Freud later went on to argue that not only were these forces acting on us, but they were happening at different levels. As we mentioned before, he did focus a lot of attention on this thing called the unconscious, something that he thought he could maybe explore through techniques like hypnosis and other things we'll talk about in future slides. But he also argued that a lot of these forces were also on what he called conscious level, the level where we could recognize them. So as you're sitting here watching this video, you're probably realizing that you got lots of things drawing you into whatever behaviors you're committing right now. There maybe is a desire to learn, maybe a desire to get a better grade, maybe a desire to impress your parents, things that you kind of intuitively recognize on the surface. There's also these hidden things, Freud said, that could also be compelling us. The desire to be seen as powerful or be seen as better than specific individuals, or maybe some sexual idea could be tied into listening to these videos or performing at a certain level on tests. It's really tough oftentimes to pinpoint these things because, as I mentioned, these things are supposed to be happening according to Freud, on the unconscious level, the level that's not really accessible by your mind, yet they are still impacting your behaviors nonetheless. And his psychodynamic theory surmised that essentially each behavior was, again, a byproduct of forces coming from these two levels, both our conscious thoughts and desires and our unconscious thoughts and desires. In terms of how we could break these things down more, Freud eventually laid out several components to who we are that really made each individual unique. He talked about a lot of our conscious behaviors, things that we were doing, being a byproduct of this thing that he called the ego, something that was sort of formed and established as we developed and as we started to get a better sense of who we are and what we should do in the world. But he argued that this conscious thing, the ego, was really just a small component to who we were and what was propelling us in any given situation. He thought that most of us were primarily pushed by a contrast, or I guess two pulling forces, these things that he called the id and the superego. So he said, as a college student, you have this id that's really constantly seeking some type of satisfaction in every situation. And satisfaction can mean different things. Sometimes it's just the satisfaction of surviving, of being able to get some basic needs, but other times it could be about more kind of carnal urges, a need for sex, a need for power, a need to kind of make sure that you're better than whomever you want to be better than. And he said the thing that offsets this id is the other force within us that we eventually start to form as we grow up, called the superego. He called this oftentimes a preconscious force, where we could sort of tap into our recognition that it was propelling us, but it wasn't something that we were thinking about at any given time. Right? Let's say you are watching this video because you want to make your grandparents proud of you. And it's something that maybe is pushing you, but until I mentioned it, you never even thought for a second that that was maybe why you were doing what you were doing. Now that would be kind of an example of a pre-conscious force, where maybe it was working, maybe it was impacting you, but it wasn't necessarily something that you were thinking of at the moment. The id is considered more unconscious in that even if I said maybe this was pushing you to do these behaviors, you'd struggle to recognize that link. That's kind of the true nature of what's called the unconscious. It's so unbelievably hidden that you can't even recognize it when somebody brings it to your attention. Or the preconscious can sort of be identified if it is brought to your attention. Again, he said the ego is operating on this, what we call reality principle, where we're trying to balance the needs of the id with the needs of the superego, which are oftentimes in conflict with each other. Because what we need, what we want, is often not aligned very well with what we should be doing, what could help society best. And essentially, he said, each behavior we exhibit as a byproduct of the interaction of these things and the ego just kind of mediating and figuring out what's the best thing we can do right now in this particular situation. How does this theory then evolve into all of these different branches of psychology that I talked about before? Well, if we look at this from kind of a grand perspective, what I want you to get a sense of is that this was really the early inklings of what we nowadays call personality psychology. Its particular focus was on what made us who we were. What caused you to become the individual that you have become. And he thought that what made us who we were was, again, the byproduct of these conflicting forces, these things that were pushing us at any given moment. And if I wanted to know what made you different from another classmate or another person that you might know, it was really the differences between these conflicting forces that created individual differences. It also led him to forming another branch of psychology that we nowadays call clinical psychology, when he started looking at the quirky, the kind of abnormal, when people had extreme behaviors that couldn't be explored by just looking at what was happening on the surface. This notion of studying the unconscious, trying to understand how different desires, different components to the mind could shape atypical behavior, was, again, the first fledgling steps that many people started to take into this new branch of psychology called clinical psychology. If we're looking at what really prompted a movement towards clinical psychology in the direction of kind of Freud's theory, we have to understand that when Freud started to introduce this idea of the unconscious and started to introduce this notion that a lot of our atypical behaviors might be coming from unconscious things, he then set out to actually try to encourage people to get at the unconscious. And the techniques that he established in the Psychodynamic Institute not only, again, started to form the framework of how we interpreted clinical psychology, but it started to form the framework for our first attempts at what we nowadays call psychotherapy, where we try to find ways to explore different components of the mind to try to help people with different mental issues. His particular approach is nowadays called psychoanalysis, where you examine a person's childhood, you examine some early desires and carnal urges through kind of an exhaustive communication process that allows the unconscious mind to occasionally peek out. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's not something that we can usually identify on the surface, we can catch very easily. But he said through psychoanalysis and kind of exhaustive talking process, you can maybe get at some of those thoughts and emotions and desires that are really critical players in the development of kind of atypical behavior. We also talked about this earlier, but it's just probably worth mentioning again that hypnosis was also a major component to his psychodynamic approach because he thought that hypnosis was a path, a window into the unconscious of many individuals. In his work, he would often talk about these journeys that he would go on with his what he called patients as they started to explore their childhood under hypnosis and some of the more traumatic experiences that they'd had under hypnosis. And he contended that essentially when people were hypnotized, they were more susceptible to explaining who they were and what they were like by kind of acknowledging certain hidden desires and wants that the unconscious wouldn't allow to come to the surface when they weren't in this hypnotic state. Another thing that he started to incorporate into his psychoanalytic approaches were these things called free association tasks, where he'd ask people to kind of allow streams of logic or streams of consciousness to come out of their mouth, and then hopefully through it get at little components of the unconscious. Something that also related to it called dream interpretation, where he'd actually have people report their dreams in an attempt to actually get at certain hidden components to them. It's probably worth mentioning that this dream interpretation approach did really bring Freud to the forefront in many different universities and different areas in the United States. In the late 1800s, actually, I take that back, I think it was the early 1900s, he published a book called The Interpretation of Dreams. And in this book, he talked about how we could decode the details of our dreams to get at certain components to our unconscious. He talked about this thing called the manifest content of the dreams, which was kind of what we were dreaming, and how within it there was this stuff called latent content. The symbolism or the general ideas that that manifest content represented. And he argued that if people were really attentive to their dreams and were willing to report all the different components to it, they could themselves get to their unconscious, or with therapy through psychoanalysis while they were interpreting dreams in those approaches, kind of get at some of their hidden desires or traumas or other things that were causing some of the more undesirable behaviors that they had. Another idea that he introduced, which we still use kind of the term for today, are these things called Freudian slips, where we might say something that sounds like we're making some type of a phoneme or a morpheme error, where in fact he argued that we were actually just allowing our unconscious to come out. So if you wanted to talk with somebody and you said, "Oh, I'm so sad to see you," and you realize, "Oh, I didn't mean to say sad, I meant to say glad to see you," Freud would argue that that's more of an actual kind of peeking out of the unconscious than it is a slip of the tongue. You weren't making mistakes with the words, he'd argue it, you were actually just acknowledging your true thoughts or your true desires. Now, these types of things started to be explored by Freud, started to be eventually explored by clinicians, And there again, attempts to not only explain where individual differences were coming from, but to try to help individuals who had experienced some type of trauma or had been displaying what we would maybe call atypical personality characteristic behaviors that they desired to have altered. It was really, again, the first inklings of our current version of what we sometimes call psychotherapy, even though, as we're going to see in future classes, it's branched off in a number of directions since then. We're looking further into Freud's work. We actually see as his career expanded that he did eventually start to explore a lot of kind of unusual, more controversial ideas. Not that his ideas of the unconscious were kind of accepted and not there wasn't pushback on them. In fact, there's still to this day lots of pushback on Freud's ideas of the unconscious and whether or not that truly gives us a sense of who we are. But as he advanced, he became even more controversial. And then a lot of the things that he pushed have been met with a lot of pushback and met with a lot of scrutinizing as he started to kind of imply some really horrific things about people's minds, people's desires, and kind of the population in general. One of the areas where we still to this day see kind of inklings of Freud's theories, even though, again, it tends to upset people, is in this idea that he started to really promote in the early 1900s that he called his psychosexual stages of development. Sort of a stab at developmental psychology with a Freudian twist, if we want to kind of frame it in the framework that we've been going through so far in class. Essentially, in this theory, he argued that if we wanted to understand where people's issues were coming from, we had to focus primarily on their childhood, and we had to understand that the unconscious was this ever-evolving thing. Essentially, we were always driven by stuff, but what we were driven by changed as we progressed. He contended that all of us have this energy within us that we're constantly pursuing. And this energy, which he often called the psychosexual energy, is defined by this thing that he called libido. This kind of persistent drive that we had at different points in our life manifested itself in different ways. Now, in adulthood, libido is kind of synonymous with sexual drive. He contended that for most adults, the sexual desires, the sexual traumas we have do shape a lot of our everyday behavior. But he said this libido existed long before we were really sexual beings. He contended that when we were young, when we were born, we were also seeking gratification. It was just in a different form, in what he called the oral stage, where we were actually focused more on just stimulating our mouth, getting to explore the world through our mouth than anything else. And he contended with this theory of psychosexual development that if we didn't get enough oral stimulation at a young age, this could result in some lingering effects. Essentially, we could start to develop these things called oral fixations, where we overeat or have to chew gum or are constantly chewing our nails or other things, because somehow we just felt at that age that we weren't getting enough oral stimulation. This oral fixation, of course, could only develop, according to him, if we didn't get enough stimulation during the first 18 months of our life. At that point, he contended that these desires, this libido, then changed its focus from the oral stage to essentially our bowels and our ability to actually have control over them. The next stage, for by the lack of the word, was coined by Freud as the anal stage, where he argued that most kids started to derive at this point a lot of pleasure in being able to control their bowel and bladder movements. Essentially, being able to control that aspect of life was very gratifying for young kids. If there were any issues in potty training where parents were kind of overly strict or they were trying to control it but they just couldn't, they contended that this could potentially, again, evolve into other fixations later in life.
In fact, some of you might have used a term straight from Freud's book and not known that you were actually referencing Freud when you used it. If any of you have ever called a friend anal retentive or yourself anal retentive, know that essentially you're implying when you talk about how cleanly you are or how your friend likes to have everything organized, and that's why I use the word anal retentive, that you or your friend, when you're saying you're anal retentive, according to Freud's theory, had some potty training issues. And because of it, you have these residual effects where you need some type of orderliness in your life because you couldn't get those needs met from about a year and a half to 3 years of life. As you're worrying about this, though, thinking about how you do like to chew your erasers or your pens, or you do like to have all of your books organized in a specific way, or your bed has to be made in a specific way, please be reminded that there has been a lot of pushback on Freud and his theories since he introduced them. And most researchers nowadays have kind of come up with a consensus that there really was no merit to this idea. It's actually, again, what made him a very controversial individual. Even if we can sort of embrace his ideas in that they allowed the areas of clinical psychology and personality psychology to form, a lot of the content within these ideas were nonsensical. And most people believe that a lot of this stuff around these psychosexual stages of development was extremely nonsensical and extremely problematic because it resulted in lots of issues. And if we're looking at the one stage where these issues were most prominent, it was probably in the next stage that he talked about called the phallic stage, where he argued that children often start to identify with a gender at around 3, 4 years of age. And they start to, as they're identifying with the gender, really try to kind of push toward their own gender while also pursuing, in some weird, unusual way, some type of relationship with a member of the opposite gender. So he argued that many kids at this phallic stage, again, not the best terminology, but we'll just go with it, at this phallic stage started to explore differences in genitalia, started to explore differences between gender, and started to develop some mental health issues or just kind of perspectives on the world issues revolving around this idea of gender. He contended that many girls, by the time they reached 4 or 5, started to develop this thing that he called penis envy, where he can kind of assume that most girls just were, for the rest of their lives, jealous of males and feeling kind of inadequate because they, for some inexplicable reason, really wanted a penis. For those of you that are very taken aback by this, I need to say again, there was really no merit to this. And if you're looking for kind of an interesting story on the topic, know that when Freud did retire, his daughter, named Anna Freud, and one of his colleagues, uh, uh, I'm blanking on her name right now, but one of Freud's colleagues actually decided to, pretty much the moment that Freud retired, push this new idea of something called womb envy that was kind of a rebuttal of Freud's penis envy idea. And their argument was that essentially men started to, by the time they got to about 3 or 6, recognize that they didn't have wombs, and because of this, try to put down women for the rest of their lives, trying to kind of demean them or find ways to kind of subtly insult them in their attempts to try to kind of overcome their feelings of inadequacy. It's not necessarily, again, a ton of research that supports either idea, but this was the kind of stuff that Freud started to push that still reverberates sometimes today in clinical psych. So I want you to kind of hear these terms now so they're not completely out of the blue when you come across them. So, and also so you have a chance to kind of recognize that kind of lack of logic behind some of these things. If you want to close out this idea of the psychosexual stages of development, know that after about 6 years, most of us go into this thing called the latency stage, where we don't really have much libido. We're just kind of focused on the world around us. And then when we get into puberty, we have these psychosexual stages come rearing back, and essentially we start to develop our psychosexual urges the way most adults think of psychosexual urges being, where we've kind of focused on sexual gratification and all the different weird quirks that we have to what we decide is sexually gratifying. This theory of Freud's isn't necessarily the one that most people celebrate, but it really does highlight kind of the weird, unusual routes that Freud started to take and the routes that caused him to, even at the time at the end of his career, be a really controversial figure. If we're looking for other things that made Freud pretty darn controversial, another thing was the fact that a lot of his theories and his approaches to understanding personality seem to come from some very unscientific methods. This was really in the face of a lot of attempts that many psychologists have started to push in the late 1800s when the field was starting to form to ensure that psychology could be aligned with the other hard sciences like chemistry and physics and biology. Most people who were studying processes like memory and sensation and perception and all of the other topics that we've kind of been discussing so far were diligently to try to find some type of conclusive evidence or at least mathematical models that would kind of support their ideas of how different aspects of the mind worked. Freud, on the other hand, when he introduced his psychodynamic theory, relied almost entirely on his own personal insights and these things that we nowadays call case studies, kind of anecdotes or stories about specific patients that he had been working with to kind of highlight how his theories might come to life. One of the classic examples that people often cite when talking about Freud's case studies is this woman that he gave the pseudonym of Anna O to. Most researchers now suggest that Anna O was not somebody completely made up. It was actually a woman named Bertha Pappenheim, who was sort of a notorious individual at the time. She was very well off, very well established, but she was considered by many to be, I guess the word extravagant could be the way to define her. She was peculiar. Maybe peculiar is a better term that we could use. And in Freud's work, what he would often do is talk about these different maladies that, again, was, she was known as Anna O, was developing. He'd talk about how she'd lose the ability to lose her arm or lose her vision or be incapable of drinking water for a variety of different reasons. And he would talk about how he would diagnose the problem through looking at her past or looking at something that she had just recently experienced and in doing so, then come up with a strategy for her to help her. And once he'd figured out that strategy and applied it, boom, magically everything was okay. These stories, these random insights that he would have, oftentimes on massive amounts of cocaine, because he did have himself a major pain issue that he was trying to treat with cocaine. Please don't judge him too much for the cocaine thing, though, because that was kind of a commonly prescribed medication for people that had lots of pain issues. We now know the psychological effects that massive amounts of cocaine can have on individuals. And many people think that a lot of Freud's theories might have come from this massive amount of cocaine use and kind of some of the disorganization in the brain that started to happen. These case studies, these personal insights, were again the source of Freud's research. If we're going to call it research, well, I guess we should call it Freud's theories. And there's even some people that suggest that even his case studies might have been fictitious. There might have been several times where Anna O's experiences were entirely made up, and there might have been some patients, a variety of patients, most people are now content, that Freud wasn't even seeing, and he would just make these stories up to kind of highlight how his theories might work. But nonetheless, even though he wasn't being very scientific in his approach, and there was a lot of pushback, he to this day is considered one of the most monumental figures in the development of psychology. If we're looking at what he was doing, though, I want to first remind everybody of why people were so bothered by Freud in the first place. Most people nowadays just completely reject his theory of psychosexual stages of development. And most people contend that his perspective of the unconscious is very faulty. Most cognitive researchers nowadays do explore kind of subtle effects that the mind might have on us that are happening below the mental level. Sometimes we call this the subconscious. Sometimes we call it the subliminal mind. But essentially, Freud was one of the first people to introduce this notion that this thing existed. But his idea of it being kind of pushed by the id and the superego is something that just completely is not panned out in research. Another thing that has been problematic with Freud is when he talked about mental health issues being a byproduct of different drives within the individual, or different traumatic experiences, he lumped pretty much everybody with mental health issues together. And this meant that people with degenerative diseases, people with biologically traced mental health issues like schizophrenia, or even things that really are a byproduct of biology and the environment, things that we link now to kind of depression and anxiety disorders. This is stuff that Freud was a heavy advocate for kind of tying back to childhood. And it led to not only different perspectives on maybe where mental health issues were coming from, but lots of stigma with lots of individuals that had mental health issues. At the time when he introduced these ideas, there was an underlying notion, we'll talk about this later, lots of mental health issues could maybe be a byproduct of somebody catching some virus. And that theory on its own is problematic, right? You've got people that were being locked away and avoided because you were concerned about the contaminating others. But we replaced that idea with Freud's, where we suggested that people with mental health issues probably had something horrific happen to them during their childhood. It's, I guess, a slight step in the better direction, but it wasn't a very positive step, at least at this time. And when we look at Freud's attempts to understand personality and clinical psych through his really unscientific lack of rigor, we see actually a shift that took place in psychology for a number of decades, where lots of people started to try to kind of replicate his approaches, understand their particular interests a little bit better, and in ways that didn't follow the protocol that many early psychologists had tried to lay out when we were trying to establish the field. Some of you might be wondering, why do we talk about Freud then? Why do we even mention this individual that seems to be pretty toxic within the field? As I mentioned earlier, even if we reject a lot of the details within Freud's theories, his introduction into looking at different aspects of our mental world that could explain where our personalities were coming from, individual differences were coming from, that is, and where our kind of extreme behaviors and thought patterns were coming from, essentially the heart of clinical psych, really did start with Freud. And, recognizing that we are complex individuals, recognizing that our childhood matters, recognizing that sex matters. It's all stuff that we can trace back to Freud and his research. It is probably important to also acknowledge that even looking at things happening at the subconscious level is something we started to do as a result of Freud's work. It doesn't mean that we should embrace every single detail of his ideas, but it does mean that if you want to understand what led to the formation of clinical psych and personality psych, we at least have to understand the basic components of Freud's ideas and kind of where he went awry. Because what that'll allow you to do is really understand some of the future stuff that we're going to be talking about. And in the future, what we're going to be doing here in the next class in particular is looking at how Freud was really kind of spun off of by other theorists as branches of clinical psychology and personality psychology were starting to form. In our next class, we're going to start by looking at other theorists, other big individuals that started to try to shape
the field of personality psychology and the field of clinical psych in their own way, that kind of contribute their own theories and their own ideas. And a lot of these people we're going to talk about approached this the same way Freud did. But as this class evolves, we're going to look at how the field evolved and how we started to transition our approaches a little bit through progressive ideas. So our current worlds of personality psychology and clinical psychology started to take shape. So I encourage you to, if you need to, review this. Make sure you go over the books. And in our next class, hopefully we can sort of get some closure to this idea of how clinical psych and personality psych came from people like Freud and other early psychologists. I'll see you then.